In this lesson, we'll be taking a step back into ZBrush in order to create some additional subsurface scattering maps. So, as I mentioned at the end of our previous lesson, the reason that we're going to have to do this is because we have areas like the inside of the mouth that actually have quite a bit of this light bleeding that are able to come through from this backside. Also, you can start to see that we really lose a lot of definition in the actual tentacles as far as these little suckers are concerned. So we can actually create a special map that has these areas darkened out so we can make sure that we don't get too much of the subsurface backscattering effect in just these areas. And same for this inner mouth area. So let's jump back over to ZBrush real quick. And we can begin this process. So in my case, I'm going to go back to the subtools. And we'll take a look at just this ZBrush squid body final. And I'll make sure that I am at the highest level of subdivision here. So let's start. I want to make sure that I have Z-add and Z-subtract both turned off, so that way I am not actually doing any sort of sculpting on here. We'll be strictly painting with RGB intensity. So let's take this, and with just simply RGB turned on, let's go to Color, and Fill Object. There we go. Now that will wipe out all of the vertex painting that we've already done on this object, but since we've already exported the maps that we need, we really don't necessarily need to retain that information if we don't want to. So let's come back in, and I'll start by just taking our actual color here, and we'll switch this to black. And I'll come in and just kind of start to paint this inside of the mouth here. And maybe just to make this a little bit easier, we can always come back and use something like our lasso tool to come in and just hide the areas that we don't need. There we go. That'll make it a little bit easier for me to work around here. So I'll just come in very quickly around this outer area. Just kind of paint around and try to get around this lip area. This really doesn't have to be a terribly detailed map because we're just going to use this as a way of blocking light from coming in through this inner part of the mouth. Once we actually color this in, what we can do is use the black parts of this texture as a way of really blocking that backscattering effect from coming through in these areas. So really we just need a black and white map in order for this to work. Alright, so now that we kind of have this outer perimeter painted, I'll switch to a little bit larger brush and just kind of come in here and fill this out. There we go. So just a couple more little strokes here. Alright, and that'll finish us up. Now, in order to just soften this out, we can go back to our smooth brush. There we go. And again, make sure Z-add and Z-subtract are both turned off on this. And with the smooth brush activated, we can activate our RGB intensity. Maybe start to bring that up a little bit more. And just use that as a way of kind of softening out this outer edge here and make it to where it's not quite so harsh. Maybe start to bump that up a little bit more. There we go. Now we can really kind of start to see that smoothing effect start to happen. So just kind of smooth right in through here. Like I said, it doesn't really need to be really extremely detailed. Okay, excellent. So now that we have that in place, let's now start to bring the rest of our geometry back. And very quickly, as I mentioned, we can also start to kind of include these actual suckers in the map itself. So this can easily be done by using our masking. So we can go up to masking, and we can mask based on cavity. And you can see how once we do that, we can now start to come in and paint on these certain areas. Let's actually switch back to our standard brush. And now you can see that once we paint, these areas that were included in the mask have now been protected from this painting. So you can see how that gives us a way of kind of including some of this detail. Now in our case, I actually want to reverse this. So let's go to the cavity and just simply control click anywhere out in this open area to reverse that mask. And now we can come back and just start to very quickly paint in some of these areas around the actual map itself. So we'll come in and just really quickly paint up some of these suckers. And I'll do this just very quickly on a few of these different areas. And then I'll pause and continue on through the rest of these so you don't necessarily have to sit here and watch me do all of these different tentacles. There we go. So we'll come in and just very quickly paint these. I'm not really being too careful as far as the actual detail goes. So we can come down to this underneath area. There we go, kind of get right down under here. And I'll just make a few quick strokes. Again, just to kind of fill in some of these inner parts of the suckers with kind of this black paint. There we go. Just make a few quick strokes right underneath there. And just continue. Alright, so once we have that done, now we can come back, and if we need to, we can just control click and drag. Take a look at what we have. Now you can see that we do have these suckers that have now been painted in, but there are now quite a few of these kind of outlying areas that do need to come back and be filled back in. So I can always come back with white, switch to a nice smaller brush here, and just go back and just kind of clean that up a little bit more. So also around some of these outer areas that fell just outside this masked area, areas like this, we can always start to come back and just kind of repaint that over with white. There we go, and just kind of fill in some of these unnecessary dark areas. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this for just a moment while I finish cleaning up some of these little outlying black areas. And then once this is done, we'll export this out and back into Maya. Alright, so now I've gone ahead and just completed the actual cleanup of this as far as just kind of going back and now painting in some of these areas of white. So now you can see how we pretty much have these individual suckers here that roughly, for the most part, will now be able to kind of block out the subsurface scattering effect from happening in those areas, as well as from this inner part of the mouth. So now, just like what we've done earlier in this training, we can now come up and actually build up a new texture for this. So let's go 1024 by 1024. That should work out for the map size. Make a new texture for this. And my actual geometry has disappeared, and that's because right now I have this set to black, which ZBrush pretty much reads as transparent. So if that becomes a problem, we can always come back, switch this back to white, and just make a new texture. There we go. And now with the RGB intensity set all the way up to 100%, let's go back to polygons, or rather to texture, and let's go from, we'll be going from texture to color. There it is. So let's click on that, give this just a moment, and there's our new map that has been generated for us. And so now, all we have to do is export this out. So just like before, we'll go to Texture. We'll make sure we flip this vertically so that it can be read in Maya. And now just go to Export. And I'll just export this out to my Maya project. So in the ZBrush project, I'll put this in the Textures folder along with all the other textures that have been exported. So we can call this something like Backscatter Map. Oh, looks like I have my caps lock turned on. There we go. Save that out. And once we're back in Maya, we can always go back to the Hypershade. There we go. We can drop in a new map or a new file node. So we'll drop that in. This will be our backscatter map. So we'll double click on that. Go to backscatter. There we go. There's our map. And now we can just simply plug this in as the backscatter color. So there we go. Back subsurface color. You can map that in. Now, before we had this color set to something that was a little bit pinkish in color, and now we've just simply plugged in a black and white map. So we could do one of two things in order to color correct this. We could either use our HSV node again in order to correct this, or since we are just using a simple black and white image, a little bit easier way to do this would be to just simply remap this color gain, which is the brightest portions of this image, to something else. So we can just map this to something a little bit more on the pink side, and there we go. So this is a trick that will sometimes work, although it doesn't work for every situation. It can sometimes give us the ability to bypass one extra node that we would have normally had to use. So now, let's compare what we have. So we can save this for comparison and re-render. Okay, and you can see that we'll really start to make this detail on this squid's body as far as the overall suckers and the inside of the mouth. That'll really start to make that detail pop if you compare what we had before to what we have now. And again, it's just now due to the fact that the backscattering effect is not able to come through on these areas that we've defined in the map. So areas like the inside of the mouth you can see are now much darker, as well as these individual little suckers. Now, like I said, we do have displacement maps that need to be applied to this geometry in order to actually pull these suckers out and away from the geometry, but the displacement will actually start to slow down our renders quite a bit, so we do want to wait a little bit longer before we actually try to apply any kind of displacement effects onto this. So what we can do now is, now that we have the overall subsurface effect fairly close to what we want, is we can start to now worry about some of these other areas like the tongue and some of these other little drool areas, as far as now starting to set up the materials on those. So we'll start to work on that in the next few lessons.